Okay, for this screencast, we're going to be talking about the concept application question. And for this, I guess you can just follow along on the screencast, but if you happen to have the printed version, which looks like this, you might want to follow along. Okay, the concept application question is very simple. You're responding to a political scenario. You're explaining how that scenario relates to a political principle, institution, process, policy, or behavior. And very importantly, in the context of the scenario. Okay, so again, if you let's look at the concept application template and look at a sample question that's in your materials. Okay. So here is a sample prompt, and I've got, this is again something that I put together. Luckily, spent quite a bit of time on this, and they happen to be testing it. So I assume they're going to test it, but now we know they're going to test it. So let's take a look. The sample prompt is after numerous media reports and advocacy groups highlighted the issue of prescription drug price gouging in the lead up to a midterm congressional election. Several members of Congress made prescription drug prices the centerpiece of their reelection campaigns. After winning reelection, they sponsored and passed legislation that would place a price ceiling on drug prices. So I'm sure you're all thinking about economics right now with Mr. Clark. But let's talk about this prompt and how you would respond to it in a very basic concept application question. So our tasks are to describe an action that the president can take if he disagrees with the legislation passed by Congress. Now, I am modeling what I expect you to do when looking at these questions for the first time, which is highlighting, or you won't have a highlighter, but underlining or circling what is being asked. So we're describing an action that the president can take if he disagrees with the legislation. Now, obviously, what comes to most of your minds is veto, and we'll talk about that more in a second, which is good. Okay, B, in the context of the scenario, and again, that means that you have to refer to the drug price ceiling legislation. You just have to, or you don't get the point. Explain how an upcoming presidential election might affect the decision-making of the president with regard to the action described in Part A. In the context of the scenario, explain how the interaction between the president and Congress might be affected by interest groups. Now, I can tell you that this is unlikely to show up on the 2020 exam because interest groups is in Unit 5. But you probably know a little bit about them, and we'll just forge ahead regardless. Okay, so I have some do's and don'ts. Do, read the entire question carefully and identify the action verb. The action verb in this question is to describe an action. So the action verb is to describe. Underline the key components of the prompt, and I've done that here. Do, answer the question directly and succinctly. Directly and succinctly doesn't mean one-word responses. It means a complete sentence. Also, choose the what I call low-hanging fruit answer. In other words, if they ask you what the president can do, if he disagrees, well, what did you learn? Lawmaking 101, he can veto it. That is a formal constitutional power of the president in the lawmaking process. If you want to get specific, it's Article 1, Section 7, where the lawmaking process is described. The president expressly has that power. Avoid complicated responses to simple question. Reveal your knowledge of basic concepts in responses to the question first. Simple questions demand simple responses. Be sure to reference the scenario. A long, tortured response runs the risk of confounding the person grading your exam. And yes, all of the exams this year, it looks like, are going to be graded through the internet, no in-person grading. So we'll see how that goes. Also, offer an insurance point, just in case. So it's difficult to predict what's an acceptable answer on the rubric. Don't forget, if it's not on the rubric, the graders are hamstrung. They cannot give the point. So we don't know what's going to be on the rubric. Maybe they're looking for something about signing statements, and if you write, they can pass a law or they can veto the legislation, and that's it, then you're out of luck. So add an insurance point. We'll see an example there in a second. Also, use reasoning strategies to connect parts B and C. Connectors such as therefore, it is for this reason that, this is because, this is why. Do use examples in your responses, part B and C. Do not write long, rambling responses that invite off-topic lines of reasoning. So here's some examples. Part A, describe an action the president can take if he disagrees with the legislation passed by Congress. In response to the proposed price ceiling on drug prices passed by Congress, the president can veto the proposed legislation if he disagrees. If the president is being pressured by his own party to sign the legislation, however, he may instead choose to sign the bill and include a signing statement explaining his reservations about the bill. That is a very good response because it has an insurance point. Another version, in response to the proposed price ceiling on drug prices passed by Congress, the president can veto the proposed legislation if he disagrees. Very simple. That's probably going to get a point. If you just say the president can veto the legislation, who knows? You might get a point this year, but you don't mention the scenario. That is the kiss of death on these questions. You have to mention the scenario. The president can issue a signing statement. Well, that's true, but that's not the most likely action. Remember, low-hanging fruit. Okay. You got to remember, some people in the country that are taking this exam are literally freshmen, sophomores. So they haven't had a lot of experience. So you're taking a college level course. I don't know why that is. I think the vast majority of schools have it senior year like we do, but there's a reason that there's a lot of 1s and 2s on this exam. Not from our campus. Okay, let's look at this next one. My little skull and crossbones means don't do it. The president can execute a pocket veto if the bill is presented to him with fewer than 10 days left in the session. Also, very clever, but extremely unlikely. Certainly not the most likely action, and once again, no mention of the scenario. And then finally, the president was granted numerous powers by the Constitution. Article 2 sets forth the powers afforded to the president by the Constitution. However, there are many unstated powers that have evolved over time. For example, the president can address issues by focusing on them in speeches or at the state of okay, you get the idea. This person is, well, I wrote it, but this response is off the rails, is rambling. It is not focused on, and there's no mention, well, there is a mention of drug prices. So again, not the most likely action taken. Stick with what you know, which is that president can veto. For part B, in the context of the scenario, explain how an upcoming presidential election might affect the decision-making of the president with regard to the action described in part A. So our model response, if the president is concerned about an upcoming presidential election, a veto of popular legislation might hurt his re-election chances. So don't forget, if you go back to the original scenario, several members of Congress made prescription drug prices a centerpiece of their re-election campaigns. After winning re-election, they sponsored and passed. So basically, this is what we call an electoral mandate. Congress is carrying out an electoral mandate. If you've got an upcoming presidential election, the president is going to be very aware that the people just elected Congress to pass this legislation. If he vetoes it, he's going to look like a jerk, and he's going to be unpopular with the people. So the president is, if he's concerned about an upcoming presidential election, a veto of popular legislation might hurt his re-election chances. Therefore, He may be reluctant to veto legislation and might instead choose not to sign the legislation. So notice the word therefore. So you're basically explaining why a veto is not a good idea if there's an upcoming election when the president is presented with legislation that is popular with the general public. Okay, therefore he may be reluctant to veto legislation and might instead choose not to sign the legislation, in which case the proposed legislation would become law in 10 days. So that's another option we didn't talk about previously, but the president could simply not sign it. Article 1, Section 7 gives the president that 10-day clock. Okay. Alternatively, he could sign a legislation but issue a signing statement. And I think I got a hunch that, we don't know what's going to be on the exam, but if you don't know signing statements, you really, really need to know what a signing statement is. So once again, alternatively, he could sign the legislation but issue a signing statement explaining his reservations about the bill. He could, for example, explain his concern that a price ceiling would he could explain his concern that a price ceiling would have on innovation or supply in a free market system. And as you should know, when there's a price ceiling, it leads to shortages and again, plug in what you learned from Clark on if you get a question like that. Bad responses: if the president is concerned about an upcoming presidential election, he would most likely sign the bill. You haven't provided any explanation, so no points for that one. If the president is concerned about an upcoming election, he could use the bully pulpit to criticize Congress. Well, you didn't define what the bully pulpit is. You really are stating a course of action that does not make any sense with regard to the scenario. So this one is not good. Part C, and again, with the reservation that we're not officially covering interest groups on this exam, most likely, but I put a response anyway. There are numerous ways interest groups could affect the interaction between the president and Congress with regard to proposed legislation passed by Congress. For example, lobbyists working for the pharmaceutical companies might provide specialized information to Congress and the president that illustrate the potential problems with price ceiling legislation. Also, lobbyists could provide detailed information about the costs associated with developing new drugs. In other words, costs involved with securing patents, getting FDA approval, stuff like that, and how price ceilings would limit their ability to profit from their innovation and investment. Further, they could use their First Amendment freedoms to advertise the need for innovation, which could in turn sway public opinion about the legislation. So this is a fairly lengthy response for a concept application question, but I think it's a good one, and I think it's the kind of response that you should be striving for in your own work. This one is interest groups could lobby Congress to change their minds. Insufficient explanation, no reasoning. In other words, you don't have a second sentence or paragraph explaining what lobbying is. You can't just throw on words like that on your response. You have to demonstrate that you know what those words mean. And similarly, super PACs could give money to the president to support their point of view. Now, I know that we didn't get to super PACs for at least for second semester students. And again, that's inaccurate because, as you first semester students should all know, super PACs are absolutely prohibited from giving money to candidates. That is illegal under campaign finance law. If you're a second semester student, sorry, but that's, they cut it out. So we will, maybe after all this exam stuff is over, I'll do some podcasts on the stuff you missed. Okay, there is your concept application example.